Member for Sandringham.
Well, thank you, Speaker. Look, after a decade of Labor budgets, what does Victoria have to show for it? A decade of Labor debt, a decade of Labor deception, a decade of Labor deflection.
That's right.
Victorians are now paying dearly for Labor's debt-fuelled ego spending. $188 billion in debt by 2028, with more to come, and the payments have only just begun. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $305 million for the suburban roads upgrade due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $427 million for the Victorian Heart Hospital due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $558 million for the Frankston Hospital due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $3.3 billion for level crossing removals due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $4 billion for the Metro Tunnel due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $4.7 billion for the Westgate Tunnel due to blowouts and mismanagement. Victorians have been forced to pay an extra $21.2 billion for the North East Link. Why? Due to blowouts and mismanagement. So after a decade of Labor, with over $40 billion in blowouts and all this mismanagement, when this government provides a costing for anything, why bother believing it? A decade of Labor shows us that Labor budget figures simply cannot be trusted. As if that list of record-breaking blowouts wasn't enough, another example proving why Labor budget figures can't be trusted is the Commonwealth Games debacle. Labor said it would cost $2.6 billion, a figure which never really made much sense. Labor then cancelled it because it would allegedly cost up to $7 billion. In fact, the Premier herself managed to say something quite extraordinary on ABC radio when she didn't seem to see, and I quote, "not a lot of difference between $6 and $7 billion. $1 billion is not a lot of money. It's not a lot of difference for the Premier. No wonder the books are in such a mess. Then again, why am I surprised? These are the same people that have repeatedly said things cost what they cost. Well, no, they don't, or at least they shouldn't. But it does beg the question, Speaker, with that attitude, why does Labor even bother getting a quote in the first place? See, this is where the Labor government's spin falls apart.
Not their money.
After a decade of Labor, their spin cycle occasionally goes in reverse. Riddle me this. How can a government proudly boast that things cost what they cost, then cancel something when they get their numbers wrong? Unless they didn't get their numbers wrong, and it was always just going to be the con games played by Labor going into an election. Clearly, Labor conned a lot of people, and all for the low price of $589 million. How many votes did that buy? After all, it's only Victorian taxpayers' money, an absolute and utter disgrace. Labor haven't shown public money any respect in a decade, so frankly, why would they start now? When the Commonwealth Games debacle occurred, it highlighted a common theme for this Labor government. Whatever they announce has hidden hooks just lurking beneath the surface. There is always a catch. Public servants get a pay rise, while many other public servant jobs are on the chopping block. Energy bill relief, while energy prices go up, up, up. The suburban rail loop, while growth suburbs are being crushed by the pressure of population increases without proper infrastructure. The biggest hospital project in Australian history, while the government knew for at least 3 years that there would be a big problem with electromagnetic interference. A 70% cut to cancer research funding at the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre Alliance, while the government's favourite Geelong Stadium gets a new scoreboard. In Melbourne's north, there is a bizarre situation where the headline and the outcome for the community just simply don't add up. The Wallen Diamond, which includes southern-facing ramps onto the Hume, has been promised by federal and state Labor at many elections. In 2019, the federal coalition government tipped in $50 million, and at the 2022 election, then Minister Allen took the journey to Wallen to announce $130 million for the Wallen Diamond. It was later revealed after the election, deep in a major road projects Victoria document, that then Minister Allen's commitment was actually inclusive of the federal coalition's $50 million commitment. So, in fact, it was only an $80 million commitment. Planning and a business case were promised to be completed by early 2024, and we're still waiting on that. You'd think there'd be $80 million in this year's budget, but no, there's not. One of the fastest growing suburbs in Melbourne let down again by another Labor broken promise. In Narrabeen, there's the West Gippsland Hospital, which Labor committed to delivering. We saw last year funding delivered for planning, with a promise for construction to start in 2024, in line with the former Premier's announcement. Now we see no new funding in this year's budget, meaning the community have been left in the dark about when this critical project will actually start. Labor is so hell-bent on channelling money into the suburban rail loop, into blowouts, that they have simply forgotten this project. Community be damned. After a decade of Labor, there are so many more examples like these, and as anyone can see, it really doesn't take much to discover the hidden hooks beneath the surface of Labor's headlines. Labor had the title Helping Families on this year's budget. So let's look for the barely hidden hooks underneath this very headline. Helping families? How is it helpful to cut wellbeing support for school kids by $34 million? How is it helpful to cut early childhood sector supports and regulation by $79 million? How is it helpful to cut child protection by $141 million? Is that Labor's vision or version of helping? Victorians have no interest in seeing their version of hurting. This coming from a government that is spending $5.1 billion annually on programs and support in their entire family, fairness and housing portfolio, whilst at the same time spending $9.4 billion annually to service the debt that Labor has ratcheted up over the last 10 years. Another headline that they seem rather proud of is delaying the train line to Melbourne's airport. The obviously rehearsed media stunt suggesting Avalon could get funding over the airport rail is such a dishonest distraction. Set aside the fact that in 2023, Avalon served around 900,000 passengers, while at the same time, Melbourne Airport served over 30 million passengers. There's more to this headline. Notice how last election they were branding it the SRL Airport. That branding has been quietly dropped. Now it's the Airport Rail Link. I guess they couldn't accept they are delaying and potentially threatening to cancel part of the SRL. So they renamed it. Call me cynical, but I do feel this fight is less about the best outcome for everyone and more about Labor not having money to spend. And none of this needed to happen if Labor had managed money properly. To really drive the point home, here's a simple one. The headline: the government promised 80,000 homes a year. The reality? 51,000 homes were built last year, and mainly by the private sector. That pesky little fact doesn't stop Labor claiming them. That attitude of hook-ridden headlines proves that regardless of how Labor spin it, their 10th budget is a mess, and Victorians are now well and truly paying the price. Victorians were already paying the highest taxes in the country, and now Labor have made that even worse. Every single Victorian, every man, every woman, every child have a yearly Victorian Labor tax bill of $5,834 floating over their heads. What planet is this government on to think that kind of increase is okay? Labor is even doing the old double dip this year, Because Victoria is getting more in the GST, but this government is still raising taxes on that. Real cost of living relief comes from lowering taxes, something that this government just simply does not get. There is no avoiding the simple fact: Labor's record debt is too high. 10 years ago, under the Treasury leadership of the member for Malvern, Victoria's debt was $21.8 billion. After 10 years of Labor and 10 Labor budgets, Labor's debt is now $188 billion, and that figure doesn't even include the true and total cost of Labor's suburban rail loop. After a decade of Labor, there is no plan. There is no plan to deal with all this debt. Labor will claim that they have a plan to pay off their dishonestly labelled COVID debt. But even being generous, that plan is only dealing with about 17% of the total debt. Imagine if someone boasted about only planning to pay off 17% of their mortgage with no plan to pay off the rest. They'd lose their house pretty darn quickly. They aren't being honest with themselves, and after a decade of Labor, they are simply not being honest with the Victorian people. In November 2023, Speaker, the Auditor-General said, quote, "The government have not laid out a plan for when and how the state will pay down existing and future debt." Well, guess what? Labor still haven't shown any real plan. As if nearly $200 billion in debt with no plan to deal with it isn't enough of a concern, a lot of that money was financed at a time when interest rates were near zero. Now the cash rate sits at 4.35%. How much more is that refinancing going to cost every Victorian? We're also hearing from the global ratings agency S&P and Moody's that Victoria's credit rating is up for review and could be downgraded further. When the state's credit rating fell from AAA to AA, Victoria became the worst rated state in the country. That cost Victorians millions more in repayments each year. And if it drops again, it just keeps adding more and more and more to Labor's record debt. You see, record high debt means record high repayments, which to this government means record high taxes on each and every Victorian. This budget is just Labor pretending to look like they are cleaning up their own mess. None of what they've announced makes any structural changes to the fiscal equation. It just kicks Labor's debt can down Labor's pothole-riddled road. By 27-28, $40 billion per year will be spent on public service wages alone. And you guessed it, the increase is largely to more senior executives and less frontline workers, meaning declining services despite a higher public sector wage bill. And that's setting aside Labor's creeping politicisation of the public service being eroded by a culture of fear and secrecy, as boldly identified by Victoria's former Ombudsman. This budget is more of the same recklessness and irresponsible spending we see from a tired and arrogant government more focused on serving itself than the people of Victoria. That is why Victorians are paying more in taxes than any other state. Put simply, Labor just does not care. They don't care that it's more expensive to power your home, with the average price of electricity up by 33% since Labor took office 10 years ago. They care about a loop. They don't care that it's more expensive to keep warm in winter, with the average price of gas going up by 90% since Labor took office. They care more about a loop. They don't care if it's more expensive for car registration, with light vehicle rego increasing over 250% since Labor took office. They care about a loop. These are the things a state government should care about, not just a loop. Instead, they've added to record debt and only care about their loop. Generations of Victorians, some not yet born, will be forced to pay more. For what? A loop? That isn't vision, that is vanity. Vanity that will conscript Victorians to generational debt. Victorians aren't being looked after the way that they should be because Labor wants a legacy. But make no mistake, Labor's legacy will be debt. In the lead up to this budget, we had been hearing about tough decisions being made. Everyone knew that that meant cuts. $5 billion in cuts, in fact. Ambulance services and medical research funding, Labor says, cut it. Community crime prevention and seniors programs, Labor says, cut it. Family violence and mental health support, Labor says, cut it. These aren't tough decisions, Speaker. These are cowardly decisions. It's very simple. These decisions didn't need to be made. If money wasn't being wasted, programs like these wouldn't have to be cut. The Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Alliance getting their funding cut makes no sense whatsoever. Meanwhile, the state government spends more on SEC-branded clothing. So they are spending money on costumes before cancer prevention. Why are they doing that? It is just simply wrong. Cuts to family violence support and mental health support in particular should deeply concern each and every Victorian. Other cuts include road maintenance funding, cut. Housing assistance funding, cut. Disability services funding, cut. Tourism and major events funding, cut. Creative industries funding, cut. Youth justice funding, cut. Dental services, cut. Aged and home care services, cut. Access to public IVF, cut. Labor's much heralded sick pay guarantee, cut. The list goes on and on and on. And then you've got the abandoning of surgery targets, abandoning of hospital bills, promising neighbourhood batteries but not actually delivering them, the overpromised yet underdelivered number of trainee nurses, ripping $2.4 billion away from the TAC, as well as leaving the following programs unfunded. Protecting children's safety and well-being, unfunded. Child safety reforms implementation, unfunded. Mental health support for emergency service workers, unfunded. Wildlife care and protection, unfunded. Court case management system, unfunded. Speaker, despite the alleged tears from Labor members after they were told all this and more, tough decisions do not look like this. A tough decision, Speaker, for this government would be to put people ahead of spin, to value humans over hubris, to tend to the future and not to tax it. Instead, we are left with a list of unfunded and cut programs. Labor waste, Labor tax, Labor cut, and Victorians pay the price. Now that brings us to debt. S&P Director and lead analyst Martin Fu warned the government to rein in their, quote, infrastructure binge. Notice how the advice wasn't to cut any of those programs, just rein in the infrastructure binge. After a decade of Labor, debt in Victoria still remains more than New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania combined. It's time to back off the binging because Victorians simply cannot afford it. To really put it in perspective, Speaker, of just how monumental the debt Labor created is, here's something truly absurd. See, if Labor hadn't created so much debt via their irresponsible spending, they could have scrapped stamp duty entirely. Instead, they need that $9 billion a year just to pay back the interest payments on their debt. Not to build anything or fund anything, just to repay interest. That is now almost $26 million a day. Let me repeat that. If Labor didn't waste so much money, they could scrap stamp duty entirely. Can you imagine what that would do for housing affordability? Imagine just scrapping it all, or just for first home buyers and downsizers. But thanks to Labor and their near $200 billion debt, they can't scrap it. They can't even consider scrapping it. But it could have been a real conversation if they'd managed money better. See, this Labor government, Speaker, is being so desperate for cash after wasting so much money. That's why the cost of living pain is so much worse for Victorians than it in fact should be. In 1 year, the average electricity bill has gone up by 24%. In 1 year, the average gas bill has gone up by 35%. In 1 year, the average rent bill has gone up by almost 17%. People are paying 9% more for a MyKey than it should be. But if I listed every cost of living increase Victorians face thanks to the Labor government decisions, I'd simply run out of time. Victorians know that cost of living is worse after 10 years of Labor. But it's not just cost of living Labor is hurting, it's also Victorians' quality of living. You see, Speaker, every playground in Victoria should be having its soil tested for asbestos contamination at the moment. But the government is dragging its feet and avoiding doing so, potentially leaving kids at risk. Why? Because Labor waste money. The Alfred Hospital is severely run down, with patients even seeing rats running around. The government is doing little about that. Why? Because Labor waste money. Victorian roads are in an absolute mess, particularly country roads, where in some you could practically fit a small market garden in some potholes. In fact, 91% of Victorian roads are rated poor or very poor. Yet Labor has no credible plan to fix this. Why? Because Labor wastes money. The surging crime rates, schools in desperate need of repair, a lack of public transport services, particularly in growing areas like Clyde or Wyndham, ambulance ramping in code oranges, surgery wait list, a jammed-up court system, the list goes on. This is the consequence of Labor's decade of debt. It isn't just about the big numbers in red ink on a page, it is the quality of life of every Victorian that is being hurt, that is being punished. When hospitals aren't funded properly, fewer people get the care they deserve. When schools aren't funded properly, kids don't get the quality of education that they deserve. When roads aren't funded properly, people don't get the safe drive home to their families that they deserve. When public transport isn't funded properly, people don't get the reliable system that they deserve. Victorians deserve all these things, Speaker, but while Labor is in charge, Victorians don't get what they deserve. Quality of life is going backwards in Victoria, and it doesn't have to be like this. Speaker, imagine a world where Labor didn't destroy the budget. What would that actually look like? What would $9 billion a year in spending look like if it wasn't going to pay off Labor's debt? Let's make it a more manageable figure. Let's talk about Labor's daily interest bill of $25.6 million a day. In 1 day, you could pay for 128 ambulances. In 1 day, you could pay for 2 breast cancer centres. In 1 day, you could pay for 2,715 elective surgeries. In 1 day, you could pay the yearly salary of 315 nurses, or pay for 510 Victoria Police recruits, or 305 paramedics, or 488 Parks Victoria Rangers. But Victorians get none of that, thanks to this Labor government and their debt. Instead of paying for such things every day, that money just vanishes every day to pay off Labor's interest bill. It is now clear why Labor ministers have haunted looks on their faces. Labor ministers are haunted by the ghosts of budgets past, present and future. So here's an idea. How about instead of cutting funding to mental health, this government hold off building a bronze statue of their former leader? I am certain that the pigeons really, truly wouldn't mind. Of course, Labor probably won't hold off doing that. No, they won't. Why? Because this government is so out of touch that they probably think the price of a pie and a can of Coke at the footy is a good deal. Here's another idea. Pause a suburban rail loop. It is going to cost too much and it's going to take too long. Victorians know it, and so does every member of this government. So many people are doing it tough right now, so pouring billions into a project like that during times like these make absolutely no sense. Pause it. Prioritise people, improve quality of living instead of just infrastructure. If Labor don't start to improve quality of living, it's only going to get further and further out of reach. Although maybe, just maybe, the Labor government is listening to our advice. You see, the costings of the suburban rail loop are still labelled TBC. Now, when Labor say to TBC, do they actually mean to be confirmed? Or maybe it actually stands for to be canned. One could only hope, and I suspect this government's federal colleagues wholeheartedly agree. Now, even if the government isn't listening to our advice, I wonder if they will listen to the advice of their federal colleagues.
That's right.
The Labor federal government seems to understand the importance of gas, even though the Labor state government doesn't. Really. Minister for Resources Madeleine King said, quote, "Gas plays a crucial role in supporting our economy." She went on to say that, quote, "Ensuring Australia continues to have adequate access to reasonably priced gas will be key to delivering an 82% renewable energy grid by 2030. Reasonably priced gas? I wonder who has been calling for that in Victoria. You see, Federal Minister King went on to say, "It's clear we will need continued exploration, investment and development in the sector." Well, Speaker, I certainly hope the Victorian Labor MPs are listening to their federal colleagues. This contradiction between state and federal Labor highlights just how broken things are in Victoria. There's a simple solution to slightly easing the cost of living for Victorians. The federal government can see it, but the state government here ignores it. Every member of this Labor government simply ignores it. Instead, the state government just simply increases taxes on Victorians at a time when they can least afford it. Victorians have now been hit with 55 new or increased taxes thanks to this Labor government. That is quite the increase, considered on the eve of the 2014 election, the then Premier, the then Opposition Leader Daniel Andrews promised that there would be no new taxes or increased taxes on coming to power. Labor's budget last Tuesday saw an increase to two taxes, the fire service levy and the waste levy. So if you go to the tip, you'll pay more to get rid of your rubbish. The other increase pushes up council rates, which will add to the cost pressures on families. But Labor, Speaker, they're not done with taxes. There's more coming. There's the holiday and tourism tax, which would make taking a holiday in Victoria more expensive, and that is imminent. What sort of government would tax a Victorian family for wanting to take a holiday? Then there's Labor's new home ownership tax, a new building levy across all postcodes, meaning that building any residential property would become more expensive. This is on top of Labor's more than 30 new increased property taxes in the last 10 years. And they wonder why we're in the middle of a housing availability and affordability crisis. Well, if you tax something, it becomes more expensive. It is as simple as that. When MPs go out and talk to people, they get an idea of what is really going on. If members opposite have actually been outside since the budget was released, they will also hear the truth. So many Victorians are worse off because of this budget and this government. There isn't a corner of the community that isn't hurt by Labor's decisions. But Labor simply don't care. This Labor government prioritises nothing but itself. That's what this budget is, and that's what this budget shows. Dodgy decisions made not for the betterment of Victorians, but made purely to serve Labor, with the Victorian people paying for that privilege. A budget shows a government's priorities, and Labor's priorities are quite simply all wrong. Now, Speaker, Victorians do occasionally ask me, what would you do? Well, firstly, we would grow Victoria's economy by incentivising investment and providing policy certainty rather than forcing businesses to simply pack up shop. For example, we would support Victoria's incredible defence industry to pitch for the opportunity that AUKUS presents. Speaker, Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland and New South Wales are welcoming the opportunity of AUKUS to get their manufacturers, service industry, cyber and security industry into the global supply chain of the United States and of the United Kingdom. Well, it begs the question then, doesn't it, Speaker? Why hasn't Victoria done the same? Instead, Labor have raised the white flag of surrender, leaving Victorian industry without the government support they need to take Victorian-made products and services to the world. We already have a recipe for success in contributing to the defence industry in this state. Take, for example, Morand in Moorabbin. They are part of the global supply chain for the Lockheed Martin F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. From their Moorabbin facility, they produce vertical tail fins for the F-35. Now, these tail fins are assembled in Moorabbin, put on the back of a truck, driven down the Pean Highway and shipped out of Tullamarine Airport for the F-35 global assembly line. We've done it before, so let's do it again. To those businesses and to those investors who are considering leaving Victoria because of the pressure of Labor's taxes, I say to them, please, please stick with us. Labor will not always be in charge. Labor will not always, it won't always be like this. And the next election in Victoria is 2.5 years away, and change is coming. That's right. Lower, fairer, simpler taxes are coming, and a government that enables businesses to thrive is on its way. A government that will roll out more red carpet and less red tape to investors. To those people considering leaving Victoria because of the quality of living under Labor, I say to them, we will better fund schools so that kids aren't exposed to toxic mould like they have been recently at Belnarring Primary School. We will better fund hospitals so that patients don't have to wrestle with rats for a bed. We will better fund roads so that they can be safer to drive on for all Victorians. No more playing the games of dodge the pothole in country areas. We will reduce red tape and get out of the way of more homes being built to actually help with the housing crisis, not to make it worse. We will have better procurement processes to ensure value for money and to help prevent waste. We won't prioritise a loop. We will prioritise people. That is what a coalition government will do. What does Labor give Victoria? A decade of debt. A decade of dumb decisions. A change in Premier has clearly changed nothing. The cost of Labor is too high in Victoria. So to the government, stop wasting so much money. Everyone in this building, in this state, knows that we on this side of the House will be the ones again to clean up Labor's mess. And we will. We will clean it up. We will make sure hospitals and schools aren't neglected any longer. We will scrap Labor's schools tax. We will scrap Labor's health tax. We will make sure people feel safe again on the roads and in their homes. We will help the community, not hinder it. We will legislate in this chamber a debt cap. We will reinstate a Victorian Productivity Commission. We will make housing more affordable. We will maintain frontline services. We will have a credible plan to pay down Labor's debt. We will end waste. We will axe tax. We will shout from the rooftops for every Victorian, especially those who have recently left our state, that under a government we lead, that Victoria will again be open for business. We will do all these things while Labor put a loop before people. Labor can try to spin all the headlines they like, but only we, the coalition, Victoria's alternative government, will in fact govern for all Victorians. Thank you.